Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Molly Walsh, a member of the City Club's Board of Directors. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Yesterday, the inaugural GOP debate was held here in Cleveland. As many of you know, it featured 10 of the 17 official candidates. There was another happy hour debate featuring the 7 who did not make the cut. The events were the nation's first opportunity to see these candidates side by side. We also found out yesterday when we will see the Democratic candidates together on the same stage. October 13th will be the first of 6 debates among the candidates for the Democratic Party's nomination for the nation's highest office. This is fewer than during the 2008 presidential race, which featured at least 24 debates. Some Democratic candidates were quick to say that this schedule favors frontrunner Hillary Clinton. As an advisor to candidate Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland said, it is, quote, geared toward limiting debate and facilitating a coronation, not promoting a robust debate and primary process, end quote. I'm sure our speaker will address those issues and others today. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz currently represents Florida's 23rd Congressional District. Before joining the U.S. Congress, she was first a representative and later a senator in the Florida State Legislature. On May 4th, 2011, she was elected chair of the Democratic National Committee after being nominated by President Barack Obama. In Congress, Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz is an advocate for women, children, and families, authoring numerous pieces of legislation to advance their health, safety, and security. As the first Jewish Congresswoman ever elected from Florida and a breast cancer survivor, issues related to the security of Israel and women's health are priorities for Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. In 2006, she spearheaded a resolution that eventually led to the designation of May as Jewish American Heritage Month. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz was born in Long Island, New York, and received her bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Molly, and hello, Cleveland. It's great to be here. Great to be here at the Cleveland City Club, and it is really my distinct honor to join you at this venerable institution, speak with all of you today. Thank you so much to your CEO, Dan Moulthrop, and members of the board, including Molly Walsh yes? Walsh. Molly Walsh, I had it right. Shouldn't overthink it. Molly Walsh for your invitation and for that warm introduction. I have many friends in the audience today, including both of my colleagues here today, Congressman Tim Ryan of Youngstown, who has been a longtime friend. We fight side by side together. Actually, all three of us do, but Tim and I have particularly enjoyed working together from the beginning of our service in Congress, particularly when we were younger members in the 30-something working group talking about the issues on the House floor important to the next generation of Americans. And my colleague and friend, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, who represents part of Greater Cleveland, and all three of us actually serve on the House Committee on Appropriations. But I want to acknowledge and honor Marcy because she is the Dean of Congressional Women in the United States House of Representatives. That means she's the longest serving woman member, and that is a very big deal. Thank you. I want to acknowledge the Ohio Democratic Party Chairman David Pepper, and of course, Cleveland's Mayor Frank Jackson, who I just had an opportunity to spend a few minutes with. We have been able to come together many times, and I send his regrets. He was not able to stay because he has a important family obligation, and family obligations always come first. And I want to acknowledge a DNC member, Valerie McCall. She is a stalwart and in the trenches with us every single day, and also not with us because of a medical issue that came up suddenly. The CEO of Cleveland Clinic Weston, Will Barsom, who has become a good friend and who we really appreciate his leadership and his service. So your loss is our gain in Florida. We're happy to have him. I was glad to be able to meet with some of you as well, like Mark Ross and Jennifer Hennessy, who I know are here from PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I want to also offer a special thanks to Stephanie Jansky and her team for organizing this great event. Cleveland truly is a wonderful city. And as you're probably aware, Cleveland was a strong contender for the Democratic Convention in 2016. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm extremely excited about our Philadelphia convention that will be coming up next July, but I'm confident that that will be the best convention in Democratic Party history. I have been to Cleveland many times now, and it is clear to me what makes this the new American city. I'm so appreciative of your Midwest kindness and personality. It's legendary and it is deserved. And I've gotten to know so well many of your former neighbors who now live or are snowbirds in my district, and they proudly represent Cleveland South. Under Mayor Jackson, of course, the city of Cleveland has undergone an economic revitalization. Cleveland has succeeded by investing in the community, rebuilding infrastructure, encouraging small businesses, and making the education of the next generation of workers a priority. Cleveland is also a city enriched by its ethnic and racial diversity. It was the first major U.S. city with an African-American mayor, and today you can find people in Cleveland from all over the world. Now, being from South Florida and representing Miami, I think the only thing wrong with Cleveland would be the Cavaliers. Let me just let that lie right there for a moment. But in seriousness, while I can see the appeal that Cleveland would hold for the Republican National Committee, I've got to be honest in admitting that I failed to see what Republicans are offering the people of Cleveland. Now, I want to take one moment because I realized that I left someone very important out who has been an incredible fighter, not only on the behalf of her hometown and the people of Cleveland, who she represented valiantly in the state Senate, but on behalf of Americans and the middle class and people who are fighting to reach the middle class every single day, my friend, former State Senator Nina Turner. So please join me in welcoming her here as well. I would never have forgiven myself if I had left you out, Nina, so it's great to see you. Now, I mentioned Republicans. Speaking of Republicans, that was quite a show last night, wasn't it? I'm so pleased that everyone here has sufficiently recovered to be able to make it to this lunch this afternoon. But let me offer a word of caution. If you thought last night was bad, wait until Republicans come back next July for their convention. Last night was just the appetizer. We'll need to pull out the Pepto by the time the convention rolls around next summer. Let me also offer a second word of caution, because I know this historic club is a revered and nonpartisan group. I'm proud to have been invited to speak with you this afternoon. But I am going to take some shots at the Republican field today and throughout this campaign. It's part of my job as the chair of the Democratic Party. But as Tim and even Dr. Barsoom will tell you, I actually pride myself on my bipartisan relationships in Washington and in Florida. As a legislator, I've tried to forge compromise to pass legislation beneficial to my constituents. My way or the highway politics is not my MO by any stretch of the imagination, but President Obama conferred upon me a tremendous responsibility when he asked me to serve as DNC chair, where I get to talk about and advance our party's values and priorities every single day. And I also spend time defining the other side and draw that important contrast. And make no mistake, my friends, there is a stark contrast. Now, we don't know who will be the Republican nominee when they return to Cleveland in 11 months. Heck, we don't even know who's going to make it onto the stage for their next debate. But there's some drama right there. But we do know what they're going to say. We know who they're going to stand up for, and we know what policies they'll push. Because last night's debate confirmed what many of us already knew. The 47 or however many Republicans running for president are essentially all the same. They're all singing off the same song sheet, the same outdated melody, out of tune with the priorities and values of middle-class Ohioans and Americans. Now, among the biggest losers of last night's debate were clearly women. Women who were attacked at every turn as some of the candidates demeaned them with misogynistic rhetoric, talked about defunding critical women's health services, and said there should be no exceptions for abortion, even in cases of rape or incest. Now, we failed to hear any solutions for income inequality, and not even a mention of college affordability, equal pay, raising the minimum wage, or the Voting Rights Act on its 50th anniversary. Now, here is the lens through which I think this race should be viewed. First, Republican economic policies are out of date and out of touch. They want to go back to the trickle-down economic policies that have failed over and over again in the past. They want to abandon the middle-class economic policies that, as we just learned this morning, added 215,000 jobs last month and have created 13 million jobs over the last 5.5 years. Second, Republicans' divisive social policies do not embrace the inclusiveness and diversity that have made Cleveland great. And third, the Republican Party has adopted a voter suppression strategy that is making it harder for voters in Ohio and across the country to exercise their fundamental right to vote. And that's unacceptable. From the first debate to their party's convention, the Republican primary process begins and ends in Cleveland. But based on what we've seen in Cleveland so far, no matter who wins, the middle class loses. Now, in case you missed it, the Republicans had a warm-up candidate forum this past Monday in New Hampshire. Only 14 of their candidates participated in that one. Now, they took turns speaking for 2 hours, and in all that time, with all those people, just one even mentioned the middle class. And he didn't even make it into last night's top 10. And last night wasn't any better. I'm especially emboldened to say it, given this morning's jobs numbers, as I just mentioned. But let me just tell you something that none of the GOP candidates will. Middle-class economics works. When President Bush left office 6.5 years ago, remember, our economy was losing 750,000 jobs a month. The housing market bubble had burst, and the auto industry, as Ohioans know all too well, was in danger of collapsing. Instead of telling people to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, President Obama and Democrats in Congress got to work, fighting for middle-class families and those still climbing the ladders of success to get there themselves. Under Democratic leadership, we've experienced 65 straight months of private sector job growth, and benefits rose in 2014 by the most in the last 6 years. The auto industry is thriving once again, including hundreds of thousands of jobs saved right here in Ohio. Democrats have worked hard to help working Americans dig out of the hole that they were left in after the Great Recession. But at each step of the way, we've been met with Republican obstruction and opposition. Now, it's fitting that Ted Cruz was the first Republican to jump into the presidential race, because he's been their de facto leader, essentially, in Congress for the last couple of years. And he's the embodiment of everything that's wrong with the Republican Party today. Ted Cruz is out on the campaign trail suggesting that the latest fight over funding for women's health is yet another excuse to shut down the government. Obviously, he learned nothing from the last government shutdown, which he led with Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, two other candidates for the Republican nomination for president. That government shutdown cost the economy $24 billion, all so that they could try to take quality, affordable health care away from millions of Americans. Now, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, more than 16 million Americans have gained access to health care. More Americans have the peace of mind that they won't go bankrupt because they get sick, that young people can stay on their parents' health care plan, that seniors don't have to cut their pills in half to afford their prescription drugs, that being a woman is no longer treated like a pre-existing condition. People laugh every time I say that, but that was how it was before the Affordable Care Act. Just being born a woman meant you were considered as having a pre-existing condition. And Republicans want to take that peace of mind away from them. The Affordable Care Act has survived 2 Supreme Court cases and almost 60 votes in the House of Representatives to repeal or undermine the law. And yet every Republican candidate has touted repeal of the Affordable Care Act as one of their top priorities should they become president. Heck, Jeb Bush even said that it doesn't work. Well, healthcare spending is growing at its slowest rate in 50 years. And since the first open enrollment period in October of 2013, the uninsured rate in America has dropped 35%. And I know I just said it a moment ago, but it bears repeating. More than 16 million people in America have gained quality, affordable health insurance since passage of the Affordable Care Act. I have a newsflash for Republicans. The Affordable Care Act is working. It's working. And we're not going backwards. Thank you. Now, as I said, middle-class economics works. And Democrats are fighting to ensure that all Americans can afford the cornerstones of a middle-class life. What are those? Child care, health care, a home, education, retirement security. We're proud of our successes, but we know that there are more actions that we can take that would help American families right now. Actions like increasing the minimum wage, strengthening family and medical leave policies, and passing the Paycheck Fairness Act so we can move closer to equal pay for equal work. Now, equal pay isn't just a women's issue. It's a family issue and an economic issue. But Republicans don't seem to get it. Ted Cruz derided it as a show vote. Marco Rubio said the debate over it was wasting time. Rand Paul went much further and compared it to the Soviet Union's Politburo. Jeb Bush didn't even know what paycheck fairness was. Chris Christie and Rick Perry actually both vetoed equal pay legislation in their states. Imagine that. And Scott Walker went further and repealed equal pay enforcement in Wisconsin. So they're not fighting for women and families. And speaking of someone who never has and never will fight for you, there's Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush says he has a plan that can grow the economy by more than his dad or his brother ever did. It's simple, really. As he explains it, he just thinks Americans need to work longer hours. That's a quote. Work longer hours? Last night must have been the first time he ever stepped in Ohio, because he's obviously never met an Ohio worker. And then he shared another one of his brilliant plans. Jeb Bush wants to phase out Medicare. His words. Last week, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Medicare. For half a century, Medicare has existed as a sacred promise between America and its seniors, a promise Democrats intend not only to keep, but have and will continue to strengthen. But nearly every one of the Republican candidates has expressed support for the Republican plan to end Medicare as we know it, that Tim and Marcy and I have repeatedly railed and voted against. So when we say Republican policies are outdated and out of touch, that's exactly what we mean. Now, as you saw last night, all of the Republican candidates are working from the same old tired Republican playbook. Their tax cuts for the wealthy and spending cuts on crucial programs would bring us right back to the policies that brought about the Great Recession under the last President Bush. And to make matters worse, their social policies are straight from the 1950s, or perhaps the Paleozoic era. Following the 2012 election, Republicans promised, remember, that they were going to change. Remember that? They talked a lot about how they wanted to do a better job appealing to constituencies that they previously ignored. It was their aha moment, supposedly. Rand Paul was their poster boy. He went to Detroit. You just can't make this stuff up, and opened up a so-called African-American engagement office. Rand Paul, we're talking about. He went to Howard University and lectured the students at one of the nation's premier historically black colleges about the history of the NAACP. But how is Rand Paul supposed to broaden the Republican Party's appeal to African Americans when he has voiced opposition to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, when he opposes automatic voter registration and believes in, quote, a business's right to discriminate? Let me answer that for him. He can't. Just like he can't appeal to young voters when he calls for eliminating the Department of Education, would slash Pell Grants, opposes student loan refinancing, and opposes net neutrality rules to keep the internet fair for all. Geez, the facts hurt, don't they? And you can't appeal to the LGBT community when you belittle LGBT rights, saying you, quote, don't believe in rights based on behavior and that gay marriage offends you. And you can't appeal to women when you want to take a woman's health options out of her hands. But Rand Paul and other Republicans have failed to learn that they have a bigger problem than just the tone of their message. The real problem is the content of that message, their policies and their actions. Now remember Todd Akin, Mr. Legitimate Rape, and how a woman's body can shut that whole thing down? Now, okay, we can laugh at his poor understanding of biology, but every Republican running for president still agrees with him about denying a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Last night, Marco Rubio doubled down. He clearly indicated that he wouldn't protect a woman's right to choose, even in cases of rape or incest, when asked a direct question. In fact, he made sure to say that the way the moderator put the question was wrong and that that was not his position, that his position was squarely opposed to allowing a woman to make her own health care decisions, even when she's a victim of rape or incest. That's how extreme and out of touch this crew is. Plus, just this week, Jeb Bush said he thought we were spending too much on women's health and that he'd take away millions of dollars in funding for women's health care. And how about Donald Trump's hateful rhetoric about Mexican immigrants? For one, it propelled him to the top of the Republican polls, so it's obviously resonating with a significant portion of the Republican base. But more importantly, I've yet to hear a single Republican candidate explain how their immigration policy would treat immigrant families any differently than Mr. Trump has suggested. Now, if you want to prove that you're, quote, committed to community, that's an actual new RNC campaign slogan in Ohio. It takes more than avoiding racist rhetoric and taking down a flag. You can't just put up a hashtag and pat yourself on the back for showing up for a debate or a convention in Cleveland. You're not committed to community if you oppose paid leave policies that help parents take care of their family. You're not committed to community if you won't support equal pay legislation to address a wage gap that is even greater for African American and Latino women. You're not committed to community if you're against an increase in the minimum wage that would benefit up to 28 million Americans. And you are certainly not committed to community if you're standing in the way of people exercising their fundamental right to vote. It is not a secret that the election of President Obama prompted a backlash against the electoral coalition that put him in office. Voter ID laws, restrictions on early voting, and the elimination of same-day registration make voting harder when we should be making it easier. And they have a disproportionate impact on women, seniors, students, young people, and communities of color. Democrats believe that we're a better nation when more people vote, not fewer. Here in Ohio, in an alarming trend we've seen elsewhere as well, Secretary of State John Husted and Governor John Kasich have made a concerted effort to disenfranchise voters. In 2011, Ohio Republicans attempted to push through a voter ID requirement, as many of you probably know. The African American community responded by turning out in record numbers to re-elect President Obama. African Americans made up 15% of Ohio's electorate that election, despite accounting for just 12% of the state's population. Continuing into 2014, the tactics of Ohio Republicans, like the elimination of the Golden Week, disproportionately affected low-income and black voters. Once again, people fought back, and just recently, the Ohio NAACP, ACLU, and other civil rights organizations secured a significant victory that will extend early voting hours and add an additional Sunday to the early voting period. But Republican efforts nationwide to suppress the vote have been aided by the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby v. Holder to repeal key protections from the Voting Rights Act. Yesterday, the same day Republicans held their first debate, ironically, was actually the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, undoubtedly one of the most consequential and successful pieces of legislation of the 20th century. But none of the Republicans running for president support efforts that will make voting easier instead of harder. Earlier this year, I was fortunate to participate in the pilgrimage to Selma to recognize the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And I know that I was not alone in being moved to tears, smiles, and chills by the sight of President Obama and our colleague and friend John Lewis walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It is difficult to comprehend that this fight is still necessary and needed half a century later. But it is. And so the Democratic Party is committed to ensuring that every eligible voter is registered, that every registered voter is able to vote, and that every vote is accurately counted. That is the mission of the DNC's Voter Expansion Project, because we believe that our nation and our democracy are stronger when more people participate. Republicans have been so obsessed with whether they're able to participate in their debate. They've shown they don't care whether people can participate at the ballot box. It was unbelievable that not one of their candidates even mentioned the VRA anniversary last night on that debate stage. Even an acknowledgement. I mean, it was a pretty historic occasion. And no mention? These are the fundamental differences between the Republican and Democratic parties. This is what's at stake in the next election. No matter which candidate Democrats ultimately nominate, we're going to fight for middle-class families. Democrats are the party of inclusion, empowerment, and expanded opportunity. We want to make sure that everyone's on a level playing field and has their fair shot to get ahead. Republicans are out of touch, and their policies are clearly outdated. They don't have any credible ideas to move our country forward. Instead, They want to turn back the clock to the failed policies of the past. They're focused on helping out those who are already at the very top, and they'd hurt middle-class families and those still trying to get there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of my post-debate thoughts with you today. With Cleveland as the bookends, this Republican primary process should be something else. But if we learned anything last night, it's that if any of these Republican wins, the middle class loses. So thank you again. I'm sure I'll see you again and again and again over the next 15 months. And please know that Democrats are going to continue to bring our pro-middle class message to this crucial state and fight for every single vote. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Today, we are enjoying a Friday forum featuring Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Chair of the Democratic National Committee. We encourage you to organize questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. If you are joining us via our live broadcast on WCPN or our webcast and would like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via radio broadcast and web stream provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV, IdeaStream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television, radio, and web production and distribution is made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Be sure to join us on Wednesday, August 12th, as the City Club welcomes Maureen O'Connor, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Ohio, for a discussion on voter education in judicial elections. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Media Group, the sponsor of all politics and policy forums at the City Club. We thank you very much for your support. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Clinic and the Democratic Party of Cuyahoga County. We thank you all for your support. Now it's time to return to Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky. First question, please.
Thank you very much for being with us today. I admire you and your career in the Congress, but I note that polling over the last few years demonstrates that public opinion of the Congress is somewhere between 7 and 13%, positive opinion. If you could wave a wand, what would you change in order to enhance the reputation of the Congress?
Thank you for that question. It's really an important one, and I'm glad it's the first question. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, although I am the head of my national party, I'm a member of Congress who believes that my way or the highway politics is detrimental to moving our nation forward. And that's how the Democratic Party feels as well. I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe that Republicans actually might have one or two good ideas, and that perhaps we should be thinking and sitting across one another, across the table from one another, at trying to figure out not where we are divided, but how we can find common ground. And by not doing that, by having Republicans who unfortunately now are strangled by the Tea Party, and as evidenced by their debate last night, you could see that there's no room on their side of the aisle to actually be reasonable, because if they even move in that direction, they are in jeopardy of not being successful in their primary election. And the same goes true with our colleagues. We've had colleagues numerous times tell us, look, I'd love to help you, but if I support you on fixing the healthcare law, for example, or trying to actually come up with a reasonable budget compromise, I'll draw a primary on the Republican side, and I will probably lose. And that's a legitimate concern, because we actually have colleagues who we've seen lose in Republican primaries when they've been remotely reasonable. So I mean, Eric Cantor is a perfect example. I mean, the second highest ranking Republican lost a Republican primary to a very extreme right-wing Tea Party candidate who came from nowhere, because Eric Cantor was perceived by his Republican base as not being sufficiently conservative, not being sufficiently extreme. And so that really, it hurts our democracy, and it hurts our ability to move our nation forward. Look, we're going to have disagreements, and like I said, our party, has a different set of priorities than the Republicans do. But there should be many more opportunities that we have to actually put aside our differences and move the country forward together. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to interest the Republicans that are serving in Congress today at the moment.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for coming.
You're welcome.
I know what I didn't hear last night, and I think a lot of us didn't, as far as voting rights and stuff, but I also felt like I was watching a liberal, democratic debate. They talked about job growth and the poor and economic development for the poor and middle class, but the policies just aren't there. And what are we going to do? I'm a Democrat. What are you and what are your plans to do to bring people back into the political process? I go to churches. I sit with minorities, Latinos, African Americans. They are angry. They are disconnected from politics, from the Democrats, from the Republicans. And the messaging going last night was as if, they're for them, and they're not. And what are we going to do to counter that? Or what is your plan, and what can I do as a constituent here in Ohio? Because we're key, and we have to get people to vote, and we have to stop voter suppression, and we have to want people to even come out and vote. So what is your plan, and what can we do to help?
Sure. Thank you for the question. We might have been watching a different debate, or certainly listening with different ears, because. Right. No, and I understand. I know exactly what you're saying. You might have heard the words, and that's what I was alluding to in my remarks. You might have heard the words poverty, and poor, and the word struggling, because they actually believe, the Republicans actually believe, that if they use those words, if they simply mention or acknowledge those problems, that they're going to get credit for acknowledging them, without policies to actually back them up to help people change that economic situation. But voters see through that. I'm actually thrilled that the Republicans were on full display last night, because it shows voters who are struggling to reach the middle class, or who are already in the middle class and want to remain there, that exactly where the Republican candidates for president's priorities are. I mean, it's not just a line when I say that they want to go back to the same failed trickle-down economic policies of the past. I mean, Tim and Marcy and I every single day fight on the Appropriations Committee to make sure that we ultimately end up with a budget deal that has a balanced approach to making sure we can move our economy forward. That is how we got out of the worst recession that we've been in since the Great Depression, by making sure that we made reasonable cuts in spending, without cutting the heart out of people's safety net and their health care, and making sure that we don't cut education, because those are the key building blocks to reaching the middle class. Those are all things the Republicans absolutely proposed and tried to push through. And also to ask people who can afford to pay a little bit more, the wealthiest 1 or 2% of Americans, to do so. So, because you cannot cut your way to prosperity, you can't cut your way out of a recession. You have to have a balanced approach. The 2012 election was actually run on that question, in addition to on whether or not we would repeal or move forward with the Affordable Care Act. And guess what? Barack Obama and Democrats won that election, because Americans agree with us. So in terms of appeal, you will see that same clear contrast between any of our candidates and any of their candidates, where we're talking about helping more Americans who are struggling with poverty, who want to make sure that the dream of pursuing a higher education is actually attainable and affordable. while Republicans, Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, the whole lot of them, but the ones that actually have a vote in Congress, actually voted against making it more affordable for young people to pay back their student loans. Well, so actions speak louder than words. So like I said, it's no wonder that Reince Priebus, my counterpart, would have wanted fewer debates, because he realizes that the more Americans are exposed to his party's extremism, he can't control what they say, as you saw last night, the less voters will like them. And the more likely it is that eventually the Democratic nominee will be elected President of the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm over here, Congresswoman. Hi. Ruby Unger. I'm a Northern California resident and part of a family of supporters of the City Club of Cleveland.
Great.
Happily, part of that Unger family. It's an honor to ask you a question. I have admired you so.
Thank you.
You have a tough state to represent. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm coming to hear middle class as a buzz phrase that it seems every candidate is using, and even our government officials, even our revered President of the United States. And I know, as you have just talked about, the poor are really the ones who need education, safety, help, and I'm not hearing enough about that, and I'm wondering, is it because there aren't enough voters and dollar supporters among the poor who would be living at the poverty level or around that, the working poor, those who have jobs and can't afford their meager lifestyle because they have 2 or 3 jobs?
So what's your question?
What was my question? What can we do? What is the Democratic Party doing? Why aren't we hearing more? Is it because the poor don't vote?
Well, I think I just spent quite a bit of time on Democrats' economic policies and drawing a pretty clear contrast between the direction that our party has and will continue to take this country when it comes to economic policy that will help people climb those ladders of success. What I also mentioned in my remarks was that there is actually only one candidate on both stages, both the happy hour debate and the main debate, that even mentioned the middle class. That was Lindsey Graham, and he wasn't even on the stage at the main debate. So they don't have any regard for the middle class. They're using poverty now as a buzzword and income inequality without proposing or supporting any policies that would actually help people climb out of that situation. We are consistently putting legislation out on the House floor, out on the Senate floor, proposed by legislation and ideas proposed by President Obama that either never get a hearing or are complete non-starters or are actually defeated by the Republican majorities in Congress. Let me give you a few examples. President Obama proposed, and Senator Warren actually championed legislation in the United States Senate that would have allowed young people to refinance their student loans because student loan debt has actually eclipsed credit card debt in this country. I mean, even Marco Rubio said that just 4 years ago he was $100,000 in debt with college loans. Now, he asked the question last night, who was Hillary Clinton to lecture him on debt when he was in that situation? Well, Hillary Clinton supports making sure that we can make repaying your student loans more affordable. All of our candidates do. Our Democratic caucus all support that. And the Republicans voted it down. They voted to leave young people in a situation where the interest rates that they have to pay back their student loans are more than their ability to pay based on the income they earn at the moment. President Obama has proposed, and he talked about this in the State of the Union address, making the first two years of college free. I wrote a book and I talked about that as well, because it's absolutely critical in today's economy that is global and interactive, and we're not going backwards to where we shrink inward. Absolutely critical that you have a college education. in order to be able to maximize your chances for economic success, to climb out of a situation in which you aren't able to take care of yourself and your family. And Republicans refuse to even consider that legislation. Let's have a hearing on it. Let's actually have a discussion about college affordability. How about increasing the minimum wage? I mean, really? The minimum wage is a little bit more than $7 right now. I mean, who can afford to take care of a family on a wage that low? How about equal pay for equal work? Women have struggled in this country for decades, even decades after the Equal Pay Act actually became the law, and yet we still get paid on average 78 cents for every dollar a man doing the same work earns. African Americans and Latinas, as I said, are even in worse situation, 56 and 64 cents on the dollar. For last Tuesday was African American Women Equal Pay Day. That's the day in the year, in the next year, that African American women finally earned what white men earned in all of the previous year. And yet Republicans refuse to support legislation that ensures that we can enforce the Equal Pay Act so that women can actually have that mean something, so that employers know that if they don't pay women equally for doing the same job, that there are going to be consequences. So that's the difference. We are actually proposing, supporting, initiating economic policies that move our country forward, economic policies like the balanced approach that I talked about, the infrastructure bill that we were able to push through, the stimulus bill that injected a huge amount of resources into this economy when we badly needed it, where we rescued the American automobile industry on top of that. The Republicans would have let the American automobile industry go down the tubes. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in this state would have evaporated all up and down the supply chain. And Republicans opposed it almost completely, almost to the person. And they have the nerve to suggest that they actually care about income inequality because they say the word poverty out loud? Please. Yeah, I mean, really, we look forward to drawing that contrast and continuing this debate during the next 15 months of this campaign.
Chairwoman, welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you.
We're delighted to have you here. We have a number of Bernie Sanders supporters here today. And
welcome. Good to see you.
Bernie is a self-described socialist, so my question is, what is the difference between a socialist and a Democrat today?
Well, good try. Good try, but the relevant question in this campaign is what the difference is between Democrats and Republicans. Bernie Sanders is actually not a self-described socialist. You can go back and ask him and let him describe where his philosophical leanings are. But the important distinction in this campaign is between the direction and what Democrats stand for and what Republicans stand for. That's the important thing. That's the distinction that voters are going to make and decide upon when they're choosing who it is that they vote for President of the United States. So Democrats, as I said, we're the party of creating more economic opportunity, of fighting to allow people to climb those ladders of success and reach the middle class, of making sure that if you work hard and you play by the rules, that everyone should have a chance to succeed and a fair shot to get ahead. And what do the Republicans stand for? Republicans stand for taking care of people who are at the very top, who are the wealthiest 1 or 2% of this country, and cutting taxes and making sure that they can continue to do really well, and maybe their success will trickle down and benefit the rest of them. And you know, that's not just a slogan or a line. Look at the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts, which almost completely benefited the wealthiest, most fortunate Americans, and by the way, were unpaid for. So it blew a hole after President Bush inherited a record surplus. It blew a hole in our nation's deficit. And then on top of that, he invaded Iraq and also, for the first time, went to war, took this nation to war, unpaid for. So we absolutely blew up our surplus and left us in an economic crisis. On top of that, we had a housing bubble that burst, and a banking system in which the Republicans, led by President Bush and his administration, you know, allowed the fox to guard the henhouse and turned their back and said, you know, we're not going to empower the SEC to regulate the banking system. We're going to leave that process, that system toothless. And what Democrats did when President Obama took office is we passed the Dodd-Frank legislation. Now, you could argue that Dodd-Frank could have been stronger. You could argue that the Affordable Care Act could have been stronger, that there were other things that we could have done to go further. Of course, Republicans wouldn't cooperate with us on either one of those major pieces of legislation, and that's what I was referring to earlier, is if we just acknowledge that some of these things are significant problems, which sadly the Republicans won't, then we could sit down at the table together and work together. And instead of fighting over, yes it is, no it isn't a problem, we could say, okay, we do need to make sure that we can get more people access to health care in this country. Let's figure out the best way to do that. Let's acknowledge that health care is a right and not a privilege, which Republicans still today refuse to acknowledge. Let's acknowledge that our banking system was out of control and that it was rigged and unfair to consumers. That's the direction that Dodd-Frank took us. Unfortunately, Republicans, almost every one of them on that stage last night, on both stages, would support repealing both the Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank. So that is the relevant distinction that we'll be discussing in this campaign over the next 15 months, and it's the relevant issues that voters will be making their decision on who they vote for President of the United States.
Hi. Again, thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
So my question is, debates are a good forum for voter education and also to level the playing field for candidates that don't have as great a name recognition as others. So why are we limiting the debates for the Democratic Party to only 6 this year?
Well, we decided to have 6 sanctioned debates because we felt that was plenty of opportunity for our voters to get a good, and caucus goers, to get a really good look at the differences between our candidates, for them to share their ideas in a debate format, that the DNC would sanction 6 of those debates. And there are going to be many other opportunities, as we've already begun to see, for different organizations to sponsor candidate forums, and so different settings and formats for the candidates to come and share their ideas. And we've got 5 candidates, not 17 like the Republicans have. So we wanted to make sure we maximize the opportunities that they have in a debate setting. We have a 1 debate a month, 1 in each of the 4 early primary states beginning in October, right when people are really starting, just about a year out from the campaign, to really focus and pay attention to the presidential election. And then we'll have 2 after the early states primaries and caucuses. And so we think that is going to be an ample opportunity for voters to get a good look at the differences between the candidates we have on our side of the aisle.
This question is directed at your role as party chair. And every 4 years, in particular in the presidential years, national Democratic money from the DNC and Democratic donors flows into Ohio. We're told how important we are. We're told how crucial we are. In fact, we're here in Cleveland. It's all up to you. Everything's resting on you. And yet, on the midterm elections, it's a total parched desert when it comes to money, national money. And by contrast, the Republicans spend a lot of time and effort and money on state and local elections. And it feels, now we see the results. Not only nationally do they, run Congress and the Senate, but here in Ohio, they possess every statewide office but 2, statewide elected office, but 2. And it sure does feel that we didn't win much lately. And my question to you is, can we expect the Democratic Party to put the same kind of energy and commitment of resources into midterm elections that they do in the presidential?
Yes, and I absolutely. And I feel like this question was planted by me, so I appreciate the opportunity to answer it, because I couldn't agree with you more, and I was just as frustrated. I mean, if you look at the last 2 midterm elections, I'm going to be a truth teller here. Democrats have not done very well in those midterm elections, and the gory details are not pretty. We've lost 11 governorships, 13 U.S. Senate seats, 73 United States House of Representatives seats, 30 legislative chambers, and 910 legislative seats since 2009. So it is not pretty when it comes to the down ballot races. Now, we've won 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections. Our party's nominee has, and Ohio, let me say again, is always critical, particularly critical in a presidential election cycle, but also has, prior to redistricting, had a lot more battleground districts that could be fought over than you have now. Unfortunately, the Republicans have gerrymandered the redistricting process so much that there are far fewer competitive districts in Ohio and across the country. That's why we need to make sure as a party, and part of our recommendations from a Democratic Victory Task Force that I appointed immediately after the 2014 election, was to make sure that voters, as we go through into the next redistricting process, are able to choose their representatives, not the other way around, which is how the Republican Party likes to rig the outcome of redistricting. So I announced in December of last year the creation of a Democratic Victory Task Force, and they have been meeting bi-weekly, by phone and in person, to focus on what we need to do to make the kinds of investments necessary to be successful and do things like strengthening our state parties. Because, a national party can't run local elections. We need to make sure that every party has the organizational strength and the bench that has the depth it needs to be able to support campaigns up and down the ballot. So the Democratic Victory Task Force has made those recommendations, and we're in the process of implementing them. We're going to be seeking more input from our DNC membership at our summer meeting at the end of August, and we'll roll out an implementation update, probably in the early fall. But included in those recommendations, which we rolled out at our meeting in February, were that we need to focus on a national democratic narrative. It needs to be clearly understood to voters what it means to be a Democrat, whether you are a Nina Turner or a Democratic member in the South, in Georgia, or a member who represents a district in California, or the mayor of a large city versus the mayor of a small town. There are different reasons that each of those individuals would be identifying with the Democratic Party. There's a core, and we need to make sure that we're clearly communicating what that core unifying principle is, what those core unifying principles are, because if we do, and when we do, we're going to be better able to communicate that to our voters. And there are many other things that we're working on that I look forward to sharing with folks publicly, but clearly, the easier thing for me to do is just tell you, of course, we're going to focus on, midterm elections and do better and move on, but I agree, as they say, the first step to acknowledging, to solving a problem is acknowledging that you have one. The Republicans acknowledge that they're having a little bit of difficulty winning the White House, and I think that difficulty is going to continue. Unfortunately, what they did after my counterpart put out that autopsy report after the 2012 election and said, and you might remember this, he said, the good news is our principles are strong. It's just the way we say things and our messaging that's a problem. In other words, he thinks, and the party thinks, that they just need to speak more nicely. As someone said, say the words poverty, and suddenly that's going to demonstrate their empathy. They can send Rand Paul up to Detroit to open an African American outreach office, but forget the fact that, or sweep under the rug the fact that he opposed or has problems with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So we're not being cynical about this. We understand what our deficits are. We wanted to learn more about how, what the best steps forward are, and we're taking action to make sure that we can address them. So thank you for your question.
Congresswoman,
Yes.
I know we're running out of time, so let me make this a nice, simple question.
Okay.
Chuck Schumer has announced that he's going to vote against the Iran Pact. What is your position?
Well, I actually am still in the process of reviewing the Iran deal. It is intricate and has a lot of moving parts. I have had quite a number of briefings, both classified and unclassified. I'm actually flying up to Washington to get a couple of additional top secret briefings, but I'm about to take a family vacation following us just having gone into recess, and then I'm going to go home and spend some time with my constituents and talk with them and make sure that I get and hear their point of view before making a decision. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Today, we have been enjoying a City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum featuring Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Chair of the Democratic National Committee. Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is now adjourned.